Okay, we are live, and I see people joining us live. Great. Well, hello, and let me start by saying Happy New Year to all of you joining us live today. My name is Sally, and I'm your host for the day. My science work has been organizing these webinars since early last year, with the goal of openly discussing research-related matters and connecting you, our audience, to with subject matter experts. So, on that note, let's dive into today's webinar. Now, according to the International Labour Organization, the pandemic wiped out some 81 million jobs. That's a heck of a lot of jobs. So, but STEM jobs have been highly resilient during this time. In fact, it's forecasted to peak. So just in the US alone, it is said that by 2025, there is a projected growth of 3.5 million STEM jobs. And what's concerning is that it's also projected that 2 million of these jobs will go unfilled. So what is it if not for the lack of job opportunities? That narrows down to the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. And that's the goal of this webinar, to explore the current representation of women in STEM fields, to discuss the variables for women's success, including the confidence gap, the spatial skills, and the school and university experience. Also to be addressed the implicit bias and the workplace bias. And we will also touch upon current pressing topic of the moment, the COVID effect and its impact on workplace diversity and inclusion. And finally, we aim to explore recommendations, including best practices in the workplace to promote integration of female faculty. That said, please allow me to introduce you to today's panelists. We have Dr. Simone Taylor joining us from New Jersey. She prefers to be called Simon. Simon. Is it Simon or Simon?
It's Simone.
Simone, okay.
Yes.
To be sure. So, so we have Simone joining us from New Jersey. She is a publisher at AIP Publishing and co-founder of Workplace Equity Project. A little bit more about the project itself. The organization is advancing diversity, inclusion, and equity in scholarly publishing workplaces through research, communication, and advocacy. So Dr. Taylor is curious about the persistent underrepresentation of women and also minorities in leadership roles, and she continues to actively advocate for diversity, for equity, and for inclusion. So this year, last year, I'm still in 2020. So last year, she served as a reviewer of the anti-racism toolkit for allies undertaken by C4DISC, which is an alliance to address diversity and inclusion issues in the scholarly publishing industry. Last September, she served on the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers 2020 panel to address how the pandemic has affected the industry's ability to create a diverse and an inclusive workforce. So thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for joining us today. Thank you, Simone, for joining us today. Also joining us here today is Dr. Carol Muller, who is the Executive Director of Stanford Wise Ventures at Stanford University. She is also the founder and former CEO of MentorNet, a nonprofit e-mentoring network for women in engineering and science. And the purpose of Stanford Wise is to just to give you a brief introduction to Stanford Wise, is to publicize resources, build networks, and encourage research-based projects and programs to advance equity in science, engineering, and mathematics fields, including social sciences across the Stanford community. So Dr. Muller joins with individuals and organizations at Stanford to really amplify the impact of programs and research and other projects to advance equity in STEM fields. She also provides executive support to Stanford's Faculty Women's Forum and serves as a lecturer in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. Thank you, Dr. Muller, for accepting our invitation and joining us live today. And last but definitely not the least, we have Dr. Shulamit Kahn. She is the Associate Professor at Boston University, joining us live today. Dr. Kahn is an expert, and these are the words of her colleagues, on women in STEM. She is the author of Underrepresentation of Women in Science, International and Cross-Disciplinary Evidence and Debate. And she pretty much researches the entire landscape of women in STEM, from hiring to salary, then to promotion, to general acceptance rates, grant funding, letters of recommendation, productivity, the whole 9 yards. So a warm welcome to you, Dr. Kahn, and also to all of you joining us live. But first, perhaps a few housekeeping. So we will have a Q&A towards the end of the webinar for all of you who wish to perhaps on their cameras and address your questions. Please feel free to do so. You can make a request via Zoom and we'll authenticate it. But just to let you know, we are also live streaming this on YouTube. So there's going to be a permanent archive of it. So as you feel free. So either you can, address your questions in the chat or on your cameras and make it, a wee bit more interactive. So let's begin. I would like to share some stats that I came across, and we can, go through these and see to what extent it has changed. But women make up only 28% of the workforce in science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is very contradictory in the sense that from elementary to middle and high school, the proportion in terms of the number of young boys and young girls taking maths and science courses is roughly equal in numbers. So to say as many girls as many boys leave high school prepared to pursue science and engineering majors in college. But when you take a look at the number of young girls and young women majoring in the most STEM fields in college, now there is a huge gap. So, Dr. Muller, I would like to start with you. What are your thoughts on the underlying reasons for girls and for young women to diverge away from science and math throughout the education that then creates limitations for training and thereby options to go into these fields as adults?
Thank you, Sally. I've put some thoughts together about this topic, and I'm honestly not sure if sharing slides is easier for people, but we could look at these points on slides. I guess one thing I want to ask is, are we asking the right questions? Are we asking about workforce needs when we should be talking about equality of opportunities? Are we asking why there aren't more women in these fields when we should be asking why don't more males go into non-STEM fields? Have women really been missing, or have they been excluded and overlooked? I'm aware of countless books of well-intended scholars who set out to identify the handful of women in their fields and illustrate their experiences for others, and then discovered actually there were many, many more women in those fields than had ever been really acknowledged. So are they missing, or are they just overlooked? I think we also, if we're talking about workforce, we have to be talking about what are good employment opportunities, and then what essential knowledge and be needed for good employment opportunities and valued society. I do think we have to ask, are we asking the right questions at some level? And then beyond that, there's noisy data and assumptions and definitions of indicators. And I'm so glad we have Dr. Kahn with us today, because I actually have access to a lot of US data, and there's noisy data and a lot of assumptions and problems with the definitions within that data. But there are many parts of the world where we don't have good data available, or where I don't have access to it. So again, I'm looking forward to hearing more from Dr. Hahn about that. There are a number of things about the assumptions about kind of what is often called the pipeline to the workforce. And in fact, if you look at who's in the workforce in so-called science and engineering work, that's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily tightly correlate with people who have degrees in those fields. So I think we have this assumption that people with degrees in those fields will actually have the opportunity to go forward, when in fact we have lots of people in job titles called engineer and who are working in science who may have degrees in non-engineering or non-STEM fields. Another thing is that STEM comprises a wide variety of disparate fields, and sometimes the data are conflated. So there are many more women in the social sciences than men, and yet social and behavioral sciences are often included in the national indicators. There's a lot of variation between physical sciences and engineering and life sciences. So when we say STEM, it's confusing, and there are and aren't opportunities depending on degree levels in abundance in the labor market related to those fields. We also have to look at the question about what do we mean by sex if we're talking about males and females in position to one another. Is sex a dependent variable, or is it an independent variable, or is it just a correlated indicator? And of course, these days we're understanding more and more the extent to which gender is a social construct encompassing sex, but in fact, we have people who there's kind of a rainbow of these indicators, and the extent to which anything related to sex versus gender actually is related to participation in STEM is scant. We also have, at least in countries like the US, an assumption that preferences and interests are intrinsic when actually they're socially constructed and culturally influenced. And we've noted that there's a confidence gap, it's sometimes called, between men and women. And I have to ask, are we overvaluing confidence? We have many examples on the national stage where confidence actually is mistaken for competence. And I'm not so sure that we shouldn't be asking, what is it that we really need? What should we value? Does it make more sense for people to have a little bit of more humility about what they do and don't know, and express in proportion to what they have learned, a little more doubt about some of the findings and robustness, rather than assuming that confidence is always a good thing. So I guess I would want to just raise some of those questions. I think we have myths that perpetuate our culture, and probably cultures across many different parts of the world, that there are different innate abilities based on sex. There has long been a thread of brain differences and how those relate to pursuit of STEM and abilities in those field preferences. And all the research that seriously looked at those areas has found no real relevant sex differences. I'm not saying there are no sex differences. I'm just saying, as they relate to participation in STEM, pretty much all of them have been debunked. So then we're looking at the realities of culture. We're looking at historical influences and exclusions, which clearly have been there and continue in many cases. We're looking at gendered expectations, gendered behavior, and gendered experiences. So kind of to bring us back, how do I need to stop there maybe, Sally? I haven't
No,
kept an
please.
eye on the time.
I am
Okay.
keeping an eye out on the time.
Okay, good. Thank you. So if we look at explanations for sex differences in STEM participation in higher education and how those explanations have been examined over, say, the last 20 or 30 years, we saw initially a lot of focus on the individual. What were the differences in aptitude, in preparation, in achievement, in interests, or what some people call preferences, in confidence, in educational experiences? And there's a body of research about each of those, and they do find differences, again, not intrinsic, but socially constructed in preparation. And we've actually seen a lot of change in the US in preparation over the years I've been working in this field, so that we went from boys outperforming girls in mathematics in elementary school and middle school and high school to now not the case. So we have been messaging differently somehow. We still have, though, given the way our academic systems are constructed, and I believe given cultural factors, some of the ones that I mentioned, what the kinds of expectations that teachers and parents and individuals of all kinds hold about gender roles, and their intrinsic beliefs that do influence who goes into these fields. And then we have outward intentional discrimination and unconscious biases and microaggressions, leading often to more vicious sexual harassment that is really misunderstood as having to do with sex and really has to do with power and competition, and a means by which certain individuals, if left unchecked, intimidate others and discourage them from participation. And you have critical mass. If you then move from individual factors to organizational and systems factors, you have questions of critical mass and numbers. And to the extent that certain individuals may feel as if they're not sure if they belong, they're not sure if they're welcome, and they have obvious external characteristics that kind of play into everyone's behavior and reactions to them, then they may, some of them, and not all of them by any means, may feel like this just doesn't feel right to me. I don't feel comfortable here, and off they go to another field or another area of study, another department where they do feel included. And there's been a lot more attention in the last decade or so on belonging. What does that mean? How do we create the conditions for belonging? This is related to something that's often called a chilly climate. Although the real overt chilly climate does have to do with gender harassment, demeaning remarks, sexual harassment, belonging cues, and that work started back in the 1970s with Bernice Sandler and others. Were more increasingly understanding how privilege allows some people to move forward with assumptions of confidence that they belong, and leads others to question the belonging. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, Sheila Tobias and others began looking at pedagogy. Sue Rosser looked into what she called female-friendly science. What is it we're actually teaching that's actually curriculum, and how are we teaching it? And are there ways of teaching that can be more inclusive? And Claude Steele and others illuminated stereotype threat. Many have looked into biases and documented unconscious biases in evaluations of individuals. Virginia Valiant and others have looked at gender schema that operate within organizations. And then I think we also have to look in higher education, at least, at the whole rewards and incentive system for faculty members and for institutions as a whole. are there even any motivations for faculty to change what they teach, how they teach, or to teach better, or to teach inclusively? Or in fact, are they rewarded when they continue intentionally or otherwise to perpetuate ideas that only certain people have what it takes to persist in STEM fields? Again, a part of the culture. So I think if that's a sufficient kind of response, would love to hear from.
So, sorry, Dr. Muller, I think you are experiencing some trouble with your internet. You just dropped a message saying, oh, there you go. Yeah, you're back. So perhaps at this stage, I will. Yes.
I was just going to, I was ready to hear from some others.
Right, sure. Okay, great. So yeah, interesting insights. I would like to switch to you, Dr. Kahn. You wrote the book, The Underrepresentation of Women in Science, International and Cross-Disciplinary Evidence Debate. And there's quite the many pages dedicated to the stereotypes about brilliance and the male-oriented fields. What are your thoughts with regards to the way that girls' educational choices are constrained or altered? Sorry, Dr. Kahn, you are on mute.
Could you give me a few more, another minute, because I realize my slides are on the wrong computer and I can't share them where they are. Give me a second. And
not a problem, not a problem. Perhaps, Dr. Taylor, Simone, I would like to switch to you because of the work that you do. Gender disparity in academia has been a generative topic of research for many years. The Workplace Equity Project, co-founded by that you have co-founded, conducted a global survey in 2018 to map the parameters that define the scholarly publishing landscape. And you also authored the paper titled Evaluating Equity in Scholarly Publishing. Please tell us what are your findings and your thoughts of the imbalances of diversity within the scholarly communications community.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen so that you can see some of the, I can share some of our results. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thanks for inviting me to participate, and thanks for asking us to talk about the work we did. As you mentioned, we set out to map the parameters of the scholarly publishing landscape, because unlike what we've heard from Dr. Muller, in publishing, actually in scholarly publishing, most of the evidence is that women are not underrepresented in terms of their percentage in the workforce. There are, but what tends to happen is by the time it gets to leadership, there is a discrepancy. That same representation is not met through. So we decided to look at this in a bit more detail to try and understand what the driving factors were. This seemed like an appropriate time to quote Dr. Martin Luther King. It's his birthday tomorrow, and in the States, we have a day off on Monday in some states recognizing this gentleman. But this was one of, I was part of a LinkedIn group where one of my colleagues invited us all to share which quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King resonated with us, and this was one that came to mind. Back to the survey. We surveyed through the help of organizations like My Science Work and the STM and the ALPSP, got this survey out in the beginning of January, 2018, And our aim was to make it as global as possible. And we worked with organizations, international and regional, to reach their members. We ended up with just under 1,200 respondents from 6 continents. The results are published in an article in Learned Publishing, and the DOI and links to that article are there on the slide. One thing worth mentioning is that this survey was self-selecting. So it means that the responses we have are from people who chose to participate in the survey. And these results represent the sample. We got not necessarily representative of the industry as a whole, but we hope that the trends that we observed will inform our perceptions of the industry. So what did we find? We found out that the majority of our respondents, again, this might have been because of the way we reached those respondents, were from North America and Europe. But what was interesting is if you looked at the data compared with where we were born compared with where we live, it suggests that there's been some migration, primarily from Africa, Asia, and Europe to North America and Australia. What was interesting that in terms of demographic characteristics, the scholarly publishing workforce is not at all reflective of the diversity of the general population. So 96% of people have a bachelor's degree or higher. It was 81% of respondents identified as white, 83% as heterosexual. The dominant age group was the age 20 to 35, and the workforce as a whole is 76% female. We also found that there were disparities in compensation based on region. So respondents from North America report salaries in the higher bands in more significant proportions than other regions. Respondents who identify as Asian and salaries in the lowest salary band in the highest proportion. Now, caveat on that is that most of the people who identified as Asian were actually based in Asia. And we do know that that salaries in Asia generally are lower than salaries in North America. So there's some nuance around those figures. People who identify as Black report the second lowest band in the highest proportion, but people who identify as Black predominantly live in North America. So if you take that into context with the fact that North America also reports the highest salary bands, there is a suggestion that there's an ethnicity pay gap in the data. We did find clear evidence of a gender pay gap. So if you look at the percentage of men compared with the percentage of women, 33% of men reported earning higher than $100,000, but only 20% of women reported earning in that salary field. In terms of career progression, we found that the proportion of women in the workforce tends to decline with age and rank, and the reverse is true for men. Their proportion increases with age and rank. Men are twice as likely as women to be in executive leadership roles. 21% of men reported they were senior executives, whereas only 11% of women did the same. And looking at the leadership profile in a bit more detail, we compared we looked at people who identified as senior and executive managers compared with the sample as a whole. And there are few distinctions that we thought were worth mentioning. The leadership profile is more male, as we found out just looking at the split between male and female, than the sample as a whole. So the sample drops from 76% of female in the workforce to only 65% as they get into the leadership position. And we found no representation of respondents who identify as Black in the leadership profile. making it less diverse. We found clearly higher pay, less caregiving responsibility, not too surprising. One thing that was interesting, though, in terms of academic qualifications for an industry where we've already said that 96% of the workforce have a degree or higher, we found it interesting that the senior executive manager cohort actually had a higher percentage of people with no university degree at all compared with the sample as a whole. So that's interesting, and that actually is a good thing. It means that we're willing to train people where we can. The worrying part of all of this is that it seems to be that it's mainly male and or white people who benefit from that, not people of other ethnicities. We try to understand this by actually looking at the perceptions people have by asking a few questions about how they respond to career progression. And we found that respondents with characteristics more reflective of that leadership profile are more likely to report that they feel they're fairly compensated, they feel they're recognized by the leadership, and they feel they have fair opportunities for advancement. In fact, people who identify as Black in our survey most strongly disagree that people of all ethnicities have equal opportunities for promotion. And when we try to look at how people's own attitudes, we looked at attitudes of how people assess themselves and as well as how they assess others in terms of opportunities for growth. And it is interesting to see that, let me explain the categories we chose. We were looking at senior executive managers, and we thought we would also compare that with people who were underrepresented in the leadership profiles of females and Blacks, and people who were overrepresented in the leadership profile, white males, and people who identified as LGBTQ. Looking at that, senior and executive managers, not surprisingly, feel they're being paid fairly for the work they do and they have fair opportunities to be promoted in much higher proportions than the sample as a whole. And when it comes to looking at how other people fare, again, senior executive managers believe that people of all genders have equal opportunities for promotion. They tend to believe that people of all ethnicities have the same opportunities and people of all ages have. Not people of all ages. And when it comes to age, almost all characteristics are sensitive to age discrimination. But it is people who identify as Black who seem to be sensitive to all forms of discrimination. So I'll stop there, Sally, and then we can talk about recommendations later, but I'd be happy to take any questions that people might have.
Sure, great. Dr. Kahn, is it possible that we can switch to you at this stage? So, sorry, you are on mute.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see my screen at this point?
Yes, yes.
Great, wonderful. I'm sorry that I wasn't quite ready. I have two different computers that I work on at the same time. So I think the first thing I should talk about is bias, and kind of bias against you probably all know about Harvard's implicit attitudes test, which anybody can go to IAT at Harvard and take. It's about, are science and women kind of, do you think about them in the same time? When you see a scientist, is it a woman or a man? And so when does it start? Does it start in infancy? And here is it biological? You know, the evidence is a little mixed, mostly not. There might be some small things associated, for instance, with whether or not boys have a better spatial sense as an infant, but boys are also stronger as infants and they crawl earlier. So of course they have better spatial sense. They're crawling. It's those kinds of things, you know, who can tell whether there's differences at childhood, in infancy. If there are, they're tiny. And also there are a lot of ways that girls in toddlers and everything are much better than boys that have to also do with math. I mean, spatial isn't everything. Abstract, they can be very better at abstract things. So here's what I think though. It's not, it doesn't determine by when college. It's not determined at that point. It starts a little bit before kindergarten, but oh boy, it's really there. It's really there in kindergarten. Puberty in high school, it just gets bigger and bigger. And I'm not just talking about what people say, girls can't do this, but what girls say, I can't do this, or I don't want to do this. Those kind of things really get solidified by high school. So let's go to the early childhood. Before you enter school, you're influenced by your parents. There's lots of interesting studies that say things like, if you have no brothers, then guess what? Your parents might, try to do math or science things with you more than if you have brothers. Other things, if the mother has a job, and particularly if the mother has a job at all related to STEM, then you're more likely to be good at STEM and to be interested and to have a good self-image of STEM. So there are all sorts of things in your childhood, before you get to school, that could make a difference. But what we've really found is that in kindergarten, there's been studies in kindergartens, girls and boys come in with the same kind of impression, oh, I can do this math, I can do this science, just kind of, I'm good at these things. By the end of kindergarten, and so if they're asked who's better at this, boys or girls, people will say, oh, we're the same, I'm the same as, the girls say I'm same as the boys. By the time the end of kindergarten, things are starting to change. And by third and fourth grades, and there's several studies who've done this, good studies, it changes. That they have less of a sense, the girls, say, I'm better at these other things. It could be teachers, but frankly, I think it's more a question of the culture among the students, and it's just self-perpetuating. Are girls actually better or worse? So this is a picture of NAEP scores. So if you can see it, the top is what boys are better, the bottom of the line is girls are better. So these are the standardized tests. By the time you get to second grade, boys are better. It's kind of like, if you believe you can do it better, you can. That's a lot of what's happening here, but who knows? And then this is in standardized tests. And then girls start getting better down below. And then, as I said, you get to puberty and boys start getting better. Now, this is in standardized tests. It is not at all in grades. Girls are better in grades all the time in everything in those grades. But even the biggest difference, if you go here and you say, oh, that's a huge difference, this is just a huge difference, even the biggest difference is tiny. So it's in average standard deviation. So if you look at distribution, so, some people have this math score and this math score, the dispersion is so much bigger than the difference between the purple or pink and the blue line. the difference between those two lines are tiny. So there's a huge distribution in actual tests. I'm not saying ability, because I don't think it's ability, it's learned ability in tests. There's such a wide range. That is not, that's not the issue. So I think part of the issue is that, like, people are rational. At every grade, at every age, people say, what am I good at? I'm going to go specialize in it. So these are the NAEP scores for the math, the ones I showed you before, juxtaposed against the NAEP scores for in writing, and any verbal skills would look like this. And what you see is, compared to the small differences in math, there's much larger differences in verbal things like writing, and girls are always better. These are standardized tests. So if you were a girl, you'd say, oh, I'm good at this, because in fact, their tests show that they're better at it relative to how they are in math, but they can do both, but they're better on average. This is just the average. And there's been a lot of studies showing that girls and boys look at their relative strengths, and they make choices about courses to take, and even majors as you go along. A lot to do with how well did I do in these two courses? Which one do I want to pursue? I just wanted to do a few pictures of stereotypes while you're children. Things are getting somewhat better. These are two pictures drawn by 7-year-old kids. 7-year-olds, yeah. Okay, so in the 60s and 70s, there's this psychological test where they give people a piece of paper and they say, draw scientists. What do you draw? And so I drew these pictures are very different in size, because in fact, they're I tried to scale them to how often people would draw a man, because they think scientists are men, versus women, or because they think scientists are female. So you can see way more, way. I mean, actually, the size of this picture of the girl is too big relative. I want you to see a little bit. Way more people will draw males. Did draw males in the 60s and 70s. Almost everybody. So there's been a lot of improvement for them, because these days, more recently, only even less than 3/4 of people drew a male, which is real progress compared to the other one. And it's great that at least 28%, the first thing they thought of was a female. That is progress, but we've got a long way to go. So you see this biases. By the way, these two pictures were not, so I want to show you a picture drawn a little, oh, sorry, those were a little later on. I'm sorry, I got my pictures mixed up. No 7-year-old draws this well. Those were a little later. Here's the 7-year-old. Now, the 7-year-olds, it's more, I mean, is that a man or a woman? You tell me. Maybe you could argue a man, but it's much less sex stereotyped. And after, this is like really after at puberty or later, things change in that people learn sex stereotypes. Puberty is really where things start changing. By the way, Sally, tell me to shut up, because I could talk about this forever. When you want to, tell me to shut up. And there's a really fascinating study that I think about us, a culture that's mostly, it's not actually, it's matrilineal, which is, and kind of it's in somewhere in rural India. And actually, the husbands go and live with the wife's family, and the females are the ones who kind of really, everything kind of goes through them, ownership and things like that. So there is the women rule. And so somebody took that culture and compared it to a similar Indian culture, except that was more patrilineal. And to begin with, they did things about, do you want to take this competitive thing about throwing a ball and kind of into a round container can, if you get money. Anyway, so the girls and boys were equivalently willing to do this until they got to puberty. And in puberty, when there was matrilineal, there was no difference still between girls and boys. But when the patrilineal society, that's girls started saying, oh, I'd rather take, less money, but, I'd rather take the sure thing. I don't want to compete. So that's an example how really things, when you get to puberty, boys and girls look around and say, okay, no, I'm a girl. I have, I have sex. I have a sex, and this is what my sex does. And I will say, preferences are important. Over and over again, people have found that males prefer to interact with things they think about things, and females think about people. And this is kind of a cartoon that I think summarizes with some of my opinions. Is that the guys, they really don't like thinking about interactions. They would rather think, and not all of them, the ones who are really good at science, the ones at the far end of the distribution, also tend to be people who are a little asocial, and for them, they're more comfortable with things than with people. But biology is people. Economics actually is people. There's a lot of sciences that are about people. So it shouldn't make a difference. So what do I think should be done? There's a lot of evidence that there's some evidence, if you were to increase some two psychological things among everybody, girls, and let me just say, Simone, it's much worse for underrepresented minorities in this country than for white women. You are absolutely right. And I don't know enough about the world, but I sure know about America. So whatever I say is about white women here in general. So but I mention that here because, in fact, self-efficacy and growth mindset are also important for underrepresented minorities. Self-efficacy says, yeah, I can do these things. Growth mindset says, math is something that can be learned, and therefore I can learn it, but it's something that can be learned. So those two things are very important to try to intervene, at least around puberty and later, to make sure that girls feel, yeah, I can do math, or math is something that can be learned. And I see college students, and girls do think they can't get math. And I sit down with them and I say, okay, I'm teaching statistics, and I say, well, here's how you think about it. And then this bright light lights their face up, oh, I can learn this. It makes sense. And so that's what we should all as teachers be trying to do. Girls seem to shy away from competition starting in puberty, good or, there is a lot of things saying, well, they're just being practical. So there are more, there's a lot of experiments here. I'm not going to summarize them. They seem on average to shy away from them, but sometimes it's the right decision for them to be made. That would suggest that standardized tests or competitions should be made less important in getting into colleges and things like that. But certainly, I think the latter is true. Science should not be taught as engineering. Science should be taught as relating to people just as much as it relates to things. Because if that's how you do think about science, then girls and boys will be, preferences are so important, and girls and boys will equally prefer science. So I can stop there because I get to talk about academic careers later on.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kahn. That's very insightful. And as you said, we've a mighty long way to go from where we are today. At this point, I would like to really hop back to you, Dr. Muller, because research described in a report published by the American Association of University Women provides evidence that women are less satisfied with the academic workplace and are more likely to leave it earlier in their careers than their male counterparts are. So this is a twofold question. How can colleges and universities attract more female science and engineering faculty if they were to improve departmental culture to promote the integration of male faculty?
Yes, thank you. So we're looking at faculty, and partly because we know the importance of role models, but also really because if we don't have numbers of faculty who represent our populations that we draw from, then clearly there's some inequalities in the system. So some of the things that we can do are build better awareness of bias and biased behaviors in individuals, interactions, and institutional policies and practices. There are a number of ways to interrupt bias and microaggressions and harassment. And the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics published a marvelous consensus study report 2 years ago, actually in 2018, now it's 2021, so I guess technically 3 years ago, that compiled all the available research and engaged, in fact, in some new research about these issues. And one of the problems is that everyone needs to understand the extent to which their ongoing behaviors support a culture that allows for these microaggressions, demeaning comments, slights, and other bullying behavior that gets us down the slippery road to even more egregious behavior. But even the small things end up derailing women from careers in these fields. I think other things that we can do include articulating transparent, clear criteria for success and performance. Sometimes these are very murky, ambiguous, seem to have to do more with who becomes your champion and what you've actually accomplished. And so it will benefit all to have those criteria be more explicit. And for people to use rubrics in evaluation. I think we also need to ask, are the benefits clear to all who are participating in the institutional value and reward system? And how is progress assessed? What are the expectations for duration of, I was moving on to mentoring programs there, but ensuring, let me back up a minute in terms of the colleges and universities, ensuring equitable access to resources needed for professional success. We know from the case of the MIT report that there are many instances where even if you just look at salaries, there can be disparities, but if you ensure that you have salary equity, you may still not have equity in essential resources for success, including lab space, startup packages, numbers of research assistants and support for them, and mentoring. Do you have the same access to mentors and networks? Most faculty learn their work through mentoring. It's kind of on-the-job training. They learn from other people. They've only been prepared to a certain extent in their disciplinary fields, but usually very little at all for the array of responsibilities they have as faculty members. So ensuring collegial and equitable opportunities for professional development and advancement, it is critical.
Great. And I'm going to ask the second question that I had in mind, and you just Bill touched upon it when you started speaking about mentoring projects. Speaking of strategies for change, can you please share some lessons learned from Mentornet, your time at Mentornet, and also like mentoring opportunities and programs that are available for women pursuing careers in STEM fields?
Yes. So as I mentioned, mentoring is really probably the most significant aspect of professional development for faculty throughout their careers. And this is the learning and professional development that they gain from observing others, interacting from others, interrogating others about their past experience, how things work. And I think several principles apply. One is that everyone needs multiple mentors. There's very little likelihood that any one individual is going to be able to serve another individual in every aspect of mentoring that they need. So all of us should be thinking about who are the several people from whom we regularly learn. What kinds of conversations do we have? Now, the single biggest reason that mentoring relationships don't work out or fail is simply that the individuals don't meet. So the first thing you can be sure you're doing is actually taking the time, showing up, being present. Mentoring, of course, these days can be used across many modes, including email and Zoom and texts and lots of other ways to communicate beyond face-to-face conversation, though that typically occurs too. People need mentors both inside and outside their own organizations. We need to be cognizant that where mentors also are playing roles in evaluating performance, so that where they're also going to be voting on promotion and tenure, or they are supervisory in some way, that complicates the mentoring role. And so you probably want to make sure that, as well as gaining learning and mentoring from those who are sitting in those kinds of performance evaluation positions, that you also have what one of my colleagues called penalty-free mentoring, where you can explore more of your uncertainties or even alternatives in a way that won't prejudice those who may be evaluating your performance. I think we also need to provide better guidance. This is something I'm in the midst of trying to work with our office at Stanford about, our faculty development office. We need to provide better guidance both to mentors and those they mentor about how to take better advantage of the opportunities for mentoring, how to set expectations that are realistic, and make sure that both the mentor and the protege are on the same page, that the person being mentored is having their needs met, and that the benefits are clear to whoever's participating. And then we also need to think about, how do we assess progress, both formatively and summatively? And at certain points, mentoring relationships often naturally do come to an end. Sometimes they're lifetime, especially when we're talking about professionals, but other times, as people progress in their careers, they need a different set of mentors. And occasionally we have mentoring relationships that turn sour, and I'm sure you're all familiar with some, because the protege's success begins to eclipse the mentor's success, which for some mentors is a source of great pride, and for others is a source of great consternation and sometimes anger. So those are some of the things I would say about mentoring and effective mentoring. Is we shouldn't just expect it to happen naturally, because there's plenty of research that shows when we leave people to their own devices, what happens is a lot of homophily. People feel more comfortable engaging with people they perceive to be kind of like themselves. And given that many of our departments and universities and the societies in which we live are not free from those kinds of assumptions based on gender and race and nationality and language, deliberately working with situations where we help people get more comfortable mentoring across their perceptions of difference and actually help them see how much they have in common, say as faculty members in a given field. We can do better with ensuring that all participants will learn the things that they need to learn to be successful in their work as faculty members.
Thank you for that, Dr. Muller. As we are talking about next steps, I would like to talk to you, Dr. Taylor, about next steps that we as a community need to implement in order to make scholarly communications community a diverse, equitable, inclusive community that it needs to be. What are your thoughts, reflects on this?
Well, I think the themes that Dr. Muller has touched on are applicable to a range of situations. So in scholarly publishing, just addressing the key characteristics of our community, we mentioned the lack of diversity in the workforce itself compared with the general population. So there's a good place to start. Our recruitment efforts have to be a lot more inclusive than they are. We need to, so if you take a workforce that is already not very diverse, and the first thing you require when you recruit is experience in that industry, and you're never going to get outside of the pool that you currently recruit from. So we need to be a bit more inventive and a bit more creative as we look to seek out other talents, maybe go into other industries where we find people working, try to convert them to come to our industry. So recruitment efforts are key. Secondly, to the point that Sally mentioned, that Carol Muller mentioned about mentorship. Mentorship is important, and we found in our survey that many a significant amount of men had more access to unstructured mentorship relationships than did women. But at the same time, we feel that mentorship isn't enough. It needs to go beyond, build on the platform of mentorship, but to have really active sponsorship and advocacy. Because there is some research that suggests that the main difference between getting up to the next level is having an articulate vocal sponsor to take you through those stages. And women tend to not have as many of those sponsors as men do in our industry. So that's something else we're hoping we think would make a huge difference. And finally, staff retention becomes key. Very many people get disillusioned by their lack of progress through the organization because of the fact that they're in isolation, they're in a minority group, because of the fact that they don't feel they have the supports they do. So there has to be, to the point that Dr. Muller was making earlier, there has to be a lot of transparency in how we evaluate performance, in how we encourage people to move forward, in how we provide opportunities for training and development. Interestingly enough, some of the research has shown that sending people on diversity and bias training doesn't necessarily help, because they become aware of their biases, but we don't have the tools to really do anything about it. What can be useful is giving people targets on what they need to do to change the complexion and the landscape of their workforce. So it's still a work in progress, but the good thing is very many more of us are aware. I really enjoyed listening to Dr. Kahn and Dr. Muller because of their experiences in their own spaces on this particular topic. And I think this is where it starts. You know, this awareness, this realization that there are things we can do, and hopefully we build momentum and get more people moving on.
I couldn't agree more. And Dr. Kahn, finally, I don't see any other questions coming in, so perhaps I can ask you one more question before we wrap up. And I would like to wrap this up on a promising note, I hope. You have researched pretty much the entire landscape of women in STEM, from hiring to salary to promotion to general acceptance, the whole 9 yards, as I said before. Between now and the last 30 years, how will the social changes of the women's movements and all these legislations removing barriers and addressing gender equity, not to go unmentioned all the emerging research findings, support or perhaps challenge some of our long-standing approaches to advancing inclusive practices in STEM fields?
Okay, I wanted to get my slides up. Can you see my slides at this point?
Yes, we can.
Great. So thank you. And I found both of your, what you had to say very interesting. In economics, there's all this evidence about how important mentoring and role models are, as well as in other fields. But we have this great experiment in economics. We did it randomly. We assigned mentors, and it's been working really well. So I'm really into that. Are things better? Okay, so I'm going to be optimistic because I am optimistic, actually. Okay, are things better? Let's see. Well, certainly things are better from when people thought of women as, they're at home, their wives, they could. So this is from, internationally, this is the percentage of science researchers who are female. Just from the late 1990s to the 2011 to 2015, the percentage is going up. It's in Brazil, it's 50% basically. Overall, places like Japan don't have a lot of women scientists, but things are improving. This is the United States, and it's the percentage of BAs granted. And I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out quickly how to animate this, but so let me just point to important and interesting things. The dotted line is the 50% mark, and as you probably all know, women are more than 50% of BAs granted. But what subjects are they in? What are the two really big ones up here, the ones that they really dominate? Okay, the dark blue is life sciences. That's quite amazing. This one here is psychology. Psychology is a science. Some people, become professional psychologists, but many people also go into research. It's taught as a science. So there are a lot of women in the life sciences, in psychology. Now, here's humanities. Yeah, there's a lot. There are a lot in humanities, but it's not growing. This one here, I think is very important. This is physical sciences. It's light brown or whatever you want to call it. The representation of women has really grown, especially in chemistry and things like that. But it's 40%. That's pretty damn good if you ask me. And these are in terms of BAs granted. And the green one is engineering. It's still low. It's still 20%, but it started at less than 1%. So this is real progress. What didn't progress? And this is something that, is very important for the workforce: computer science. Computer science, and I can't go into it because it was started being kind of by women in many senses, but computer science has this very macho culture, and is taught in a very thing-centered way, and that's a place that we really have to think about improving. But you can't say that women are not scientists. What about PhDs? So we have, women, the percentage of STEM PhDs, science, engineering, math, technology, has up to 45% on average. And here is it broken down by some fields. This is once again psychology. These are clinical psychologists many of them researchers. This is life and social sciences, higher than 50%. So, other GEMP, by GEMP, I mean hard sciences like the physical sciences and math, not so good. Engineering, still down near 20, a little better than 20. But we see this huge growth in people-oriented sciences, which is wonderful. And in fact, life sciences are what's getting us out of the epidemic. They're where science really is taking off these days. So I don't have pictures about this, but I just will say I am presently with my co-authors Steve Ceci and Wendy Williams doing a review once again the academic life, kind of this life cycle, and look about, is there a leaky pipeline? Is there not? What's the reason? So the leaky pipeline says, oh, we lose women all the way along the way. So let's start at after your PhD, because, you know, as we saw before, you know, PhDs were pretty good. Hiring. If you look at actual hiring, and there are several different cases where the NRC had a great one, where they actually got a list of what jobs were open, who applied, and how many women and men were hired, you know, eventually in academia. There was no gender bias. Not just one study, several studies, the ones who do it, so that let's look at who applied, and then let's say what's likelihood. In fact, there was bias. This is lying. Many departments, depending on the field, were biased in favor of hiring women, particularly some departments that like engineering or where they wanted to increase their low numbers. I'm doing a meta study of publication evaluations, and a new article just came out of a whole bunch of other publication evaluations. If you look at how many women apply, women sending articles to journals, of those articles, what percentage of those by women are actually accepted? So this is the editors of journals and the reviewers of journals. Are they saying, oh yeah, we should be publishing this article or not? And is there bias there? And the answer is no. On average, there's no gender bias. Grants. So there've been a bunch of study of grants. Now, let me just say, the studies from before the turn of the millennium, there was probably all of these biases. The studies weren't done so well, but it seems like all of these biases had been there. So this is improvement, definite improvement. And in grants, many of the granting agencies were woken up by this 1990s article that said, oh, there's bias, and they have done many things to minimize the bias, and there's no systematic evidence of bias. I'm not saying there's none. One of the ones, Hubble telescope was an interesting study because, in fact, it seems like that there was bias against women in Hubble's telescopes. And that was mostly because there was a male network. And so if you know the people who want to use the Hubble telescope, then you're more likely to give it to them. So it was really the old boy network. And once they recognized it, they changed and they made it everything blind. So that was a case where you needed blindness because it was really be giving out, not based on your publications, but based on who knew who. Salaries. I haven't seen the best kind of, I've myself done a study of salaries without publication data, so I can't tell you, but in academia, there's no systematic of large salary differences, especially not at the assistant and associate levels. There might be a full, and I say this, on average, women who get PhDs in science do make less. But the reason is because they go into academia rather than to industry. Industry is where the big money is to be made in science. And the women are more likely to go for the research opportunities in academia. And that's why on average, they're definitely making less. But within sectors, if they are making less, it's less than 5%. However, women do publish less. They send fewer submissions to journals, and okay. Women do apply less for grants, for the first grant, for the subsequent grants. And I have to say that children are a major issue. And there's some really good research that says women are doing fine until they have to choose between children and research. And that is a huge problem. So what can be done? First of all, by the way, we want to focus on thinking about where women are, where they're strong. If you have academic policies that really have no value but keep women out, maybe because, you know, for whatever reason, you can try to change those. You should change those. Postdocs, I wrote an article about postdocs. Postdocs are very, in biology, which is where all the women are, in psychology, you need at least a 4-year postdoc. And what that means, those are the 4 years that you are in your prime childbearing ages, right?
Forgive me, Dr. Kahn, but we are way over
Okay.
our
I'm going to
schedule.
say, this is my last slide, but I also say include women. So these are the things that we can do. And I'm very sorry to have gone over, but we're not doing badly. We're doing better. We can still do better. And part of it is that women have to figure out a way to have children, spend time with children, and you know, write articles, and frankly, you know, the institutions can improve them, can help them.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Sure.
Kahn. That's been very insightful. And on behalf of my son's work and all of us joining live today, I would like to thank our panelists for the insights they brought in. And I'm sure this cannot be summed up into a 1 hour or a 2-hour conversation, but rather an ongoing conversation and an ongoing evaluation. So on that note, I would like to wrap up, but reminding that to all of you joining that we will have another webinar next month on the 25th, Thursday, the 25th of February, where we will be discussing the long-term effects of, the long-term effects of a prolonged lockdown / pandemic on the mental health and the physical well-being of adults and children. So the focus will be primarily mental health. And on that note, I wish you well, stay safe, and thank you for joining us live today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
And Muller, Dr. Muller.
Nice to meet you guys too.
It's a pleasure.